Hi everyone, welcome to session 8, part 1 of 2 of evolution. Today we've come to this topic of evolution and we shall attempt to sail through the stormy seas. It's a big topic today and it could be the subject of much controversy and debate. Now, what I will say at the outset is that I'm no expert in the topic and I'm still learning. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. My background is in protein biochemistry. So I'm still learning about evolution and how life developed on Earth. In the last 3 lessons, going back to recap, Angel talked about the challenges facing current scientific origin of life theories to explain how the first cell and necessary building blocks came into existence by natural mechanisms alone. Given these challenges to the origin of life question, the next challenge in our understanding of the natural world is a question of how did all of life continue to develop after the origin of life? As seen in the fossil record, what we observe is this increasing complexity and diversity over life over time. And so what accounts for these observations? Well, in biology, mainstream dogma presents evolution as the leading scientific explanation for the history of life's development. In biology, evolution is considered a fact. And so what is evolution and what science supports it? Almost immediately, maybe some of you have this primal defensive reaction instinct kind of kicking in and the hairs are sticking up on the back of your head. And maybe why is that? Well, usually after a science and faith talk, one of the most common questions that people will ask is, what about evolution? The fear is if evolution is true and all of life, including mankind, descended from a common ancestor, in other words, a single-celled microbe that emerged out of a primordial soup through random, unguided processes, the apparent design of life is therefore an illusion. There's no such thing as an ultimate purpose to things, and it's just about the survival of the fittest. Furthermore, because science is what says evolution is true, invoking the supernatural action of some intelligence, in other words, God, is unnecessary. Evolution is most compatible, therefore, with an atheistic worldview, and natural mechanisms are just enough, sufficient to explain life. So it is made to seem like Christians have to either choose between something that is often caricatured to be this old creation myth akin to fairy tales, or they have to accept that life gradually evolved through random and natural processes without any supernatural intervention, which would mean that they would have to walk away from their beliefs or somehow cope with how to coexist with both of these contradictory ideas. And so it's no wonder that Christians can sometimes feel threatened or have this knee-jerk fear of this whole topic of evolution because they're made to feel like to believe in the Bible, they have to take off their thinking caps and just believe. But why is there this kind of dichotomy? Why so dichotomous? What I described are the sort of 2 most extreme viewpoints. However, there are other viewpoints that actually fall somewhere in between these 2 extremes. Another question that is commonly asked in a science and faith talk is, do you believe in evolution? I mean, I think it's a genuine question. I think a lot of people are honestly wondering, as a Christian, is it okay for me to believe in evolution? And is it true? Is that how life developed? Like, should I actually believe it? To get at this question, we first need to define what evolution is. People may be using the word evolution to mean a wide range of different things. It was once described as an accordion word, and it's often the case that it's when people are using the term evolution differently that arguments can arise. And so there are a lot of views and debate between various camps regarding evolution, including within the scientific community and even between non-believing scientists. And I think it demonstrates that we need to approach the question with humility and caution. There are a lot of new data and discoveries being made, more fossils, more genomic studies and comparisons of different organisms, DNA sequences, and things like that. So I think it's fair to say that the jury might still be out on this one. I don't think we actually know enough to be able to decisively say which viewpoint is the best explanation. But for the purposes of this course, our goal for you is to be familiar with some of the differing views amongst Christians on evolution. I don't think you need to necessarily pick what camp you'll have to side with, but you may want to find out more about a particular view that interests you. Here's an outline of what we want to do for the rest of our lesson. We want to talk about evolution, and why it matters. So what is evolution? It's important in this discussion to define evolution and describe the contemporary evolutionary paradigm, be on the same page about that, and what is an overview of the scientific and historical data that supports evolution. Next, how do we interpret this data and the evolutionary paradigm? We'll talk about atheism and evolution, teleology in biology, contingency, and convergent evolution. In part 2, we'll take a look at some Christian viewpoints on evolution. Evolutionary creationism, also known as or referred to as theistic evolution or biologos, and some challenges that evolution faces, and also looking at intelligent design. So what is evolution? Evolution states that life developed gradually over time through the descent of organisms through the mechanisms of natural selection and random variation, later more precisely stated as random genetic mutation. This was a scientific theory, of course, put forth by Charles Darwin, published in On the Origin of Species in 1859, and was the foundation of evolutionary biology. Now, breaking the definition of evolution down a little bit, William Lane Craig describes evolutionary biologist Francisco Ayala's definition of the contemporary evolutionary paradigm into three different aspects. The first is evolution. It's the descent of living things with modification. Ayala defines evolution as this process of change and diversification of living things over time. And so organisms, they descend from prior organisms plus modifications. Second, evolutionary history. That is the reconstruction of the universal tree of life, the thesis of common ancestry. And so this claim, it presupposes common ancestry. This idea that all organisms came from a single ancestor rather than a bunch of ancestors. And from this, the history of life is a reconstruction of how various lineages branched off from each other. Third, Darwin's contribution to the evolutionary paradigm was that the mechanism behind evolutionary change is natural selection operating on random variation in living things. And so Darwin used this mechanism to explain how organisms adapted to their environment. In modern times, after the discovery of DNA as the information-bearing molecule of life, this mechanism, like I referred to earlier, is natural selection operating on random mutations, genetic variations. And so let's take a look at some of the supporting evidence for the first two parts of this evolutionary paradigm. The fossil record. So geology, it matured as a field during the first half of 19th century, around Darwin's time. Geology showed that the layers of rock strata represented sediments that have accumulated over time, as seen here, for example, in the Grand Canyon. Now, when fossils are found, we know that the lower the layer, the older the fossil. In addition, the age of fossils are typically determined using radiometric dating methods. Also, the fossil record is, when we look at it, largely incomplete. We only have a small portion of organisms that were preserved as fossils, and only a fraction of those that have even been discovered. In some cases, though, paleontologists and geologists can reconstruct evolutionary lines using fossils, looking at descent through the succession of forms over time. And so this diagram that depicts the possible evolutionary history of the horse shows that the horse started as a small horse, about the size of a small dog. It was called Hyracotherium, and it evolved into the modern horse over a period of 55 million years. So according to the figure, over millions of years, the number of toes changed from several toes to one toed. The teeth changed from teeth that were appropriate for browsing to grazing. The size of the horse also became much larger in size. There are a few quick things to notice on how to read this tree diagram. In this tree diagram, the branches indicate when a new species derives from another one, and the width of that branch indicates the estimated population size. And also, if you notice and you look down, most of all species have become extinct, and many species existed in the past, but now there are only about two kinds of modern horses. Next, Darwin thought that if organisms come about more or less gradually by evolution, then we should expect to see intermediate species. When Darwin's Origin of Species was published, there were actually none known, but he was confident that they would be found. And a year later, Archaeopteryx was found. The skeleton was found to be like a reptile of a small dinosaur, the size of a crow, but it also had many features typical of birds, including its head and its wings. Thousands of fossils of intermediates of hominids have since been discovered as well, with new fossils still being discovered, which are thought to be intermediates between our ape ancestors and modern humans. Homologous structures in different organisms also seem to suggest descent from a common ancestor. In this example, comparing the four-limb bones of a dog, a bird, a whale, and a human, when you compare them, they reveal a similar bone organization, even though these forelimbs are used for very different purposes. Darwin's argument was, how does one explain this kind of similarity? In human engineering, when you think about it, you got planes, cars, and boats. We don't repurpose the same parts that are organized in the same way, but we use new materials to build different structures altogether. If these organisms had developed independently, then one would have expected to find different forms of bone organization in different parts. And so it would seem like this similarity would be best explained by a common ancestor. Finally, perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from comparisons at an even smaller scale, at the level of molecular biology. This came to light a century after the Origin of Species with the discovery of DNA as the information-bearing molecule of life. Appreciate this a little bit. Humans, the amount of genetic information in our genome is 3 billion base pairs, and it can be thought of as a long string of letters. It would take 500 volumes the size of the Bible to contain all the letters of your complete genome. And that's how much genetic information that we have in just about every single one of our cells. The genetic information is a wealth of data that can be used to reconstruct evolutionary history, and the degree of similarity can actually be very precisely quantified. The first example of how genetic homology could be used to reconstruct evolutionary history was with the protein cytochrome C. It's a protein necessary for cellular respiration, and this was work done by Walter Fish at UC Irvine in 1967. Now, this protein is 104 amino acids in length, and the sequence is compared here in the human, monkey, and horse versions of cytochrome C. When the sequence of the amino acids in these three organisms are all lined up, they are mostly similar. Between humans and monkeys, there is only one difference at position 66. Between humans and horses, however, there is an additional 11 differences, and that of a tuna by an additional 21 amino acids. So using this info, a basic evolutionary history can be reconstructed. Interestingly, using this one gene taken from dozens of different organisms, from yeast to moths to kangaroos to humans, an evolutionary history or tree can be reconstructed. The inference can be made that the more similar the protein sequence, the more recent the common ancestor. Moreover, this sequence homology, comparing protein and DNA sequences, can be used to cross-check the inferences that have been made from comparative anatomy and other means. Because of its quantitative nature, the sequence data from molecular biology is quite authoritative in terms of reconstructing evolutionary history. And so take all of the thousands of genes and proteins in any organism, and when these kinds of comparative analyses are done, the evidence from molecular biology serves to provide more support for the idea of common ancestry. So to review, the contemporary evolutionary paradigm consists of three distinct aspects. Evolution is the descent of living things with modification. Evolutionary history is a reconstruction of the universal tree of life, this idea of common ancestry. And Darwinism is the mechanism behind evolutionary change, is natural selection operating on random variation in living things. And so the supporting evidence comes from the fossil record, the discovery of proposed intermediate species, comparative anatomy, the similarities in bone organization in structures used for different purposes in different species, for example, and finally, genetic homology. So what explains all these observations? Now, we began with the questions that people often ask, such as, what about evolution? Do you believe in evolution? And there's also this perception, right, that evolution threatens belief in Christianity. However, thus far, our discussion of the three aspects of evolution, of the evolutionary paradigm, they all lie in the scientific realm. We're looking at fossils, studying comparative anatomy, looking at genetic sequences, and trying to reconstruct possible connections and evolutionary histories based on that thesis of common ancestry. And the data, it does seem to point towards that direction. Thus far, these descriptions of nature are neutral. They're trying to figure out the what and the how. They don't make any claims as to why things are this way. Now, in order to get at those kind of ultimate explanations of what would explain why, we need to go to different interpretive lenses to try and understand why things might be this way, if there's some other underlying explanation. And this idea of different interpretive lenses is quite commonplace when we think about how we might interpret a given set of facts or certain events. And, you know, if you look in the news, different outlets, different political leanings, they use a certain lens that are composed of certain assumptions or values to interpret those facts or data points. And so in a similar way, there are different ways to interpret the scientific data that are used to support the contemporary evolutionary paradigm. And so for the scope of this class, we'll look at atheism and two viewpoints that are in line with Christianity. So beginning with atheism. Atheism's main interpretive lens is that the natural sciences is the sole basis for reliable truth, scientism, and it's also the disbelief in God. However, as we discussed previously, something that's problematic with atheism or evolutionary naturalism is that it undermines the foundation of the very rationality that is needed to form the rational basis for naturalism in the first place, and therefore making it self-refuting. Nevertheless, with that aside, the way that evolution fits into atheism is that Darwinism, the idea that evolution occurs through natural selection and random variation, shows that the development of life occurred through purely natural and chance mechanisms. All of life is one big cosmic accident, in other words, and it just happened to develop this way. The atheistic interpretation of Darwin states that the evolutionary development of life happened according to random chance, and it is by definition directionless and therefore also purposeless. Again, atheist evolutionary biologists claim that the theory of evolution destroys any notion of divine design, or human purpose, and therefore everything in life is a matter of chance and the random outcome of happenstance. And so Darwin's theory seems to provide solid scientific evidence for the claim that there is no need for a divine designer or intervener. Okay, so this is how atheism interprets Darwinism. Recall here the third aspect of the evolutionary paradigm as described by Ayala. In addition to atheists, one might also add that Darwinism is viewed as universal and timeless, this universal and timeless principle that can be applied throughout the universe and all of reality. However, this elimination of any sense of design or purpose, going back to that idea, by the atheistic interpretation, it goes beyond Darwin's intentions and is not necessarily true. So let's take a look at this. Darwin didn't actually hold to such a view, nor did those who stick rigorously to the scientific analysis. Darwin's intention was not to imply that random chance therefore meant directionless or without purpose. Darwin's theory of evolution was not intended to be taken as something that proved that there was no evidence for design or purpose. In fact, even in the outset, this was a common misconception that had to be clarified by Thomas Huxley, one of Darwin's greatest proponents. At first, Huxley thought that Darwin's theory of natural selection, that it was a death blow to design and purpose, or teleology. Teleology here simply meaning goal-directed behavior, or progressing towards a purpose or a goal. For example, the purpose of the eye is for vision. We have eyes because we need to see, versus looking at that from a naturalistic perspective, which would say, because we have an eye, we have vision. So Huxley, he changed his mind though, because Darwin's theories, he realized, didn't actually necessitate an elimination of belief in God or belief in teleology. Huxley addresses three common criticisms to Darwin's theories that resulted from a serious misrepresentation of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So we'll take a look at these. The three are that chance meant no design, and that no teleology also meant no design, and that Darwinian theory was therefore anti-theistic. Darwin, though, actually never took an atheistic stance. So let's take a look at each. The first misrepresentation. People thought that when Darwin said that variation and the survival of the fittest were by chance, chance therefore substituted providential design. But what did Darwin actually say? He said he didn't know what caused certain things to happen, even though things still went according to the laws of causality. So in other words, it's possible that in seeming randomness, evolutionary history could still fall within God's providential design. Secondly, Huxley said that, quote, a common objection to Mr. Darwin's views was that they abolish teleology and eviscerate the argument from design. In other words, because there is no progression toward a purpose or a goal, the evidence defeats the argument from design as had been developed by William Paley. Now, while Paley's views were indeed challenged by Darwin's theory of evolution, Huxley pointed out that this was not necessarily completely true either. The theory of evolution may be bearing witness to a wider teleology that is deeply rooted in the structure of the universe. So it was the scope of design that was observed in life that had to change, that needed to change. The scope of design. Another way to understand what he's saying is that the process of evolution itself may have been somehow designed, or there's a teleology to it. There's still an end or purpose to the evolution of life. Finally, thirdly, the third common objection was, isn't this theory anti-theistic? Well, now with the first and second ideas clarified, having shown that Darwin's theory was not determined by the belief in chance and the disbelief in design, Huxley argued that it was obvious that the doctrine of evolution is neither anti-theistic nor theistic. Once again, I think this is a reminder of something that we learned from the philosophy of science section, that science by itself is religiously neutral, and therefore the contemporary evolutionary paradigm does not necessarily require God or exclude God, though one may argue over the probability of which interpretive lens might actually make better sense of the evidence. Darwin didn't raise new problems for theism or specifically for Christianity. His ideas could be found to be, in fact, compatible with theism. Some of the theological or philosophical problems that people thought resulted from Darwinism had actually already been around long before and would continue long after Darwin. So, for example, the problem of suffering and evil that's seen in life, how do we connect God to his action in his world, like identifying acts of special creation, those kind of questions. And so this is quite a different take, I think, on Darwin than the atheist evolutionary biologists. To say that Darwin destroyed belief in teleology and therefore showed that belief in God was outdated and nonsensical, these are conclusions that simply were not true. Darwin didn't believe that, nor did Huxley. And so why does this matter? Well, because of this misreading of Darwin, I think some Christians have ended up feeling like they need to abandon or automatically reject the notion of biological evolution because it's been made to seem so incompatible with divine creation and providence. To concede evolution would mean saying that everything developed somehow by chance and therefore conceding design and purpose. However, in fact, that's not true. The evolutionary paradigm can be quite compatible with the Christian worldview. So going back to now thinking about atheism, with the idea of evolution rejecting teleology, Neo-Darwinism took that idea and made it axiomatic truth around 1970 and said that evolution was to be understood as an open-ended, indeterminate process without any predetermined goal. French atheist Jacques Monod argued that teleonomy had displaced teleology in evolutionary biology. there was only apparent purposefulness and goal-directedness of structures and functions in living organisms that resulted from Darwinian evolution. Atheists seized on that idea, though historically this was not Darwin's description or intent, and as we have seen, that has had a large impact on the perception that evolution and atheism are so closely linked. Atheists needed to continue pushing this idea. Richard Dawkins famously said in Blind Watchmaker, "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." So to summarize, I would argue that the proper view of Darwinian evolution is that it is a provisional scientific theory about the origin of species open to revision over time. However, it's the interpretive lens of atheism that takes Darwinian evolution to be a meta-narrative or a worldview, a grand theory of reality that is permanently true. Okay, so what have we talked about so far? Let's do a quick recap so that everyone can understand the gist of what I'm trying to say in simpler terms. The topic of evolution can be controversial, but it doesn't have to be. When talking about evolution, it's important to know what each person means when they say the word evolution. And so simply put, evolution seeks to explain how life developed. Evolution says that life developed gradually through successive generations of organisms, and so over long periods of time, we see species changing and adapting to their environments by the process we call Darwinism, natural selection operating on random variation. Next, we talked about how atheism has a particular take on Darwinian evolution, which is actually a misunderstanding of Darwin's original intent. Nevertheless, because evolution seems random and directionless, atheism has taken that idea and says that there really is no design or purpose in biology. It just seems that way, and therefore God is unnecessary. However, once again, Darwinian evolution, properly understood, is really just a scientific theory about how life developed. There's a good amount of evidence for it, but by no means does it necessarily need to be extrapolated into this grand story that explains everything about life. In fact, properly understood, the evolutionary paradigm can also be compatible with the Christian worldview. However, the tides seem to have started to turn in the last decades regarding this notion of teleology in biology and evolution. And so next we'll talk about that, teleology in biology and contingency and convergent evolution. What do the use of teleological explanations of biology and the observation of convergent evolution tell us about the possibility of a deeper structure in biology? It's widely accepted that some notion of teleology is essential to make sense of what is observed in nature. We see design in biology, whether actual or apparent. It's not an endorsement necessarily of the Christian notions of design or purpose in nature, but it does undermine that simplistic slogan, Darwinism defeats teleology. That's characteristic of some recent atheistic writers. So biologist Francisco Ayala talks about how the notion of teleological explanation is fundamental in modern biology. For example, when accounting for familiar functional roles played by parts of living organisms, like the wing of a bat, a mammal, and the wing of a bird, which is for, those are for flight, we speak of those wings as different solutions to biological problems that living organisms needed to solve, flight. The use of teleological explanations in biology is not only acceptable, but indeed indispensable. For example, in describing spider silk. Spider silk is a protein fiber spun by spiders, and they use it to make webs, which are sticky and are made to catch prey, to eat, and they build cocoons to wrap up prey with the spider silk, to build nests for their offspring to float through the air or escape from predators. Spiders can vary the thickness and stickiness of their silk for these many different purposes. When studying the structure and function of molecular machines like ATP synthase, an enzyme that makes ATP, the energy storage molecule of the cell, what does it do? The protein embedded in the mitochondrial membrane, it utilizes a proton gradient to power a motor that spins and then catalyzes ATP synthesis. Another neat example is when we think about biomimicry. Teleological explanations of biology are helpful in engineering and design. So for example, let's watch this video that actually talks about how engineers try to improve the Shinkansen bullet train in Japan.
In 1989, Japan's Shinkansen bullet train had a problem. It was fast, really fast, like pushing 170 miles per hour fast. But every time it exited a tunnel, it was loud. The noise was coming from a variety of sources, but whenever a train sped into a tunnel, it pushed waves of atmospheric pressure through the other end. The air exited tunnels with a sonic boom that could be heard 400 meters away. In dense residential areas, that was a huge problem. So an engineering team was brought in to design a quieter, faster, and more efficient train, and they had one secret weapon. Eiji Nakatsu, the general manager of the technical development department, was a birdwatcher.
Different components of the redesigned bullet train were based on different birds. Owls inspired the pantograph. That's the rig that connects the train to the electric wires above. Nakatsu modeled the redesign after their feathers, reducing noise by using the same serrations and curvature that allow them to silently swoop down to catch prey. The Adelie penguin, whose smooth body allows it to swim and slide effortlessly, inspired the pantograph supporting shaft, redesigned for lower wind resistance. And perhaps most notable of all was the kingfisher.
The kingfisher is a bird that dives into water to catch its prey. The unique shape of its beak allows it to do that while barely making a splash. Nakatsu took that shape to the design table. The team shot bullets shaped like different train nose models down a pipe to measure pressure waves and dropped them into water to measure the splash size. The quietest nose design was the one modeled most closely after the kingfisher's beak. When the redesign debuted in 1997, it was 10% faster, used 15% less electricity, and stayed under the 70 decibel noise limit in residential areas. And it did all that with the wings of an owl, the belly of a penguin, and the nose of a kingfisher. There's a name for design like this. It's called biomimicry.
Pretty cool, huh? When we study the structure and form of organisms, we can gain insight into solving actual engineering design problems, as that bird-watching Japanese engineer was inspired to do, taking tips from birds. I mean, copying nature helps in engineering, right? Ernst Mayr, one of the leading 20th century evolutionary biologists who invented the modern philosophy of biology and evolutionary biology, agrees with this idea of teleology in biology. It's useful to use ideas of design and purpose to understand and explain biological phenomena. Biologists continue to use teleological language because it is methodologically and heuristically appropriate and helpful, and it's legitimate. In other words, it helps in the learning process as you're studying biology and life. And he said, the occurrence of goal-directed processes is perhaps the most characteristic feature of the world of living organisms. And so here's a few more examples. Nature abounds in processes and activities that lead to an end or goal or a goal-directed behavior. Here are a few more. What's an eye for? It's to see the environment. The lotus leaf structure makes it possible for it to self-clean when it rains. What's the immune system for? To defend the body from infections and intruders. What's DNA for? It's an information molecule that carries the information needed for an organism to develop, to survive, to reproduce. What's mitochondria for? It's powerhouse of the cell, producing usable energy from various metabolic sources. What does a flying tree snake? Why does a flying tree snake undulate in flight? That helps it to stably glide better, further without tumbling as it jumps out of a tree. These examples serve to show us that teleological explanation is fundamental to modern biology. Next, now taking a step back to think about teleology in biology as a whole, there's this big question when thinking about evolution. Now, is evolution itself directional, teleological, or is it random and contingent? Things happen by happenstance or by chance. The big question is directionality implicit within evolution, whether one chooses to interpret it, evolution, teleologically or not? Now, if we note how this question is worded, it is a legitimate scientific question. It's not a speculative or a theological one. So what are some of the responses to this question? The dominant position in evolutionary biology today says that evolution is open-ended, without predictabilities, and indeterminate in terms of its outcomes. It's random and contingent. And contingent, again, just means subject to chance. The other view takes the observation of convergent evolution as evidence of a directionality in evolution. So we'll take a look at contingency. With regards to contingency, Stephen Jay Gould said, almost every interesting event of life's history falls into the realm of contingency, and therefore it's pointless to talk about purpose, historical inevitability, direction. The evolutionary process is governed by contingencies, that is, chance events in history, and this is known as a contingency thesis. He said, we are the accidental result of an unplanned process, the fragile result of an enormous concatenation of improbabilities, not the predictable product of any definite process. And so the analogy that is often used here is that if we were to replay the tape of evolutionary history, we would not see the same thing happening each time in the same way. For example, to go from a prokaryotic cell to a eukaryotic cell would have taken maybe 12 billion years versus the 2 billion years that scientists say that we see. He said, quotes, alter any early event ever so slightly and without apparent importance at the time, and evolution cascades into a radically different channel. But is this really the case? What are some other observations that we have? And this is where we get to the challenges of this contingency thesis. Cambridge paleobiologist Simon Conway Morris of the Burgess Shale Cambrian explosion challenges the dominance of contingency. Interestingly, he actually argues the opposite, that if you rerun the tape of life as often as you like, the end result will be pretty much the same. Very interesting. He makes the argument that the number of evolutionary endpoints is limited. There's a certain predictability of evolutionary outcomes. There's a way in which life converges, even if you were to run the tape multiple times. And so he's referring here to these broad phenotypic manifestations, not the specific genetic details. And this is actually what is observed time and time again. This phenomenon is what biologists call convergent evolution, which is organisms that are not closely related genetically or phylogenetically independently evolve similar traits in order to adapt to their environment. Convergent evolution is the recurrent tendency of biological organization to arrive at the same solution to a particular need. So let's take a look at some examples. Simon Conway-Morris's case is based on a thorough and systematic compilation of many, many, many examples of convergent evolution in which two or more lineages have independently evolved similar structures and functions. So let's watch a video where he describes a classic example of convergent evolution.
If you think of the classic example of convergence, it has to be the eye. You and I look at each other, and we are using what's called a camera eye. In other words, we've got a double chamber. In the middle, there's a lens that focuses the light and impinges on the retina and then goes to the back of our brain, and the rest is history. Now, so it turns out that something like a camera eye has evolved independently about 7 times. I took the precaution of bringing along an octopus. Okay. And if I show you this octopus, then what we have here is an animal which is now, unfortunately, dead. You'll see that there are many familiar things about it, including its body here. And although we're not going to dissect it, just about here, there's a brain. And of course, it's got the famous tentacles. And I could tell you stories about convergence throughout this animal. It is in many ways almost an honorary fish. But let's concentrate just on the eyes. Now, the eyes are located just about there. Okay. To cut a long story short, if I was to dissect out this eye and look at it, its construction is almost identical to ours. But, and this is the crucial thing, this is an octopus, this is a mollusk, and in fact one of its close relatives is an earthworm. Okay. You and I are chordates, and some of our closest relatives, and I don't have them here because they're not very edible, are starfish. Okay. If we consider the common ancestor of ourselves and the octopus, it probably had extremely simple eyes, what in the trade we call eye spots, but it would have had nothing like the complexity of this, the camera eye. So in essence, we can say these have arrived at the same solution completely independently.
Pretty cool, huh? Here are a few more interesting examples. We have the aerodynamics of hovering moths and hummingbirds, the convergent evolution of silk by spiders and some other insects for use for various purposes, the convergent evolution that we see in whales, dolphins, and sharks. Sharks were around long before dolphins and whales and have substantial differences. They are cold-blooded versus warm-blooded and so on, but they both have striking similarities. Both have torpedo-like bodies, side fins or flippers, and dorsal fins. Here's a chart of marsupials paired with their placental counterparts. Evolutionary history shows that they shared a common ancestor maybe 130 or so million years ago and diverged temporally and geographically, but yet as each mammalian lineage evolved independently, for example, marsupials developing a different mode of reproduction with those tiny babies continuing their early development in those pouches, right? What's interesting is that a variety of species arose that adapted to similar habitats in similar ways. Simon Conway-Morris said, quote, "The details of convergence actually reveal many of the twists and turns of evolutionary change as different starting points are transformed towards common solutions via a variety of well-trodden paths." So what do the patterns seen in biological history show us? Well, that life repeats itself, and it has an almost eerie ability to find its way to the correct solution repeatedly. So the physics and chemistry of our world stays the same. Those are the constants. And it's the biology that is best adapted to physics and chemistry that thrives. The significance of this observation of convergent evolution is that it seems to reveal the existence of stable regions of biological space. Of course, contingency is still a factor in the overall evolutionary mechanism, but it's not as decisive or as significant as Gould is saying. We can think of it as something like there are these islands of stability. Evolution seems to converge on a relatively small number of possible outcomes, and we see it happening everywhere. It's widespread, despite the infinitude of genetic possibilities. In evolution, there are many routes, but the destinations seem to be limited. And so life has a peculiar propensity to navigate to rather precise solutions in response to adaptive challenges. And so that's what's observed. Now, what's a possible explanation of the observations in evolutionary biology that there's this apparent ability of the evolutionary search process to navigate its way to find these islands of stability? First, the view that evolution is open-ended without predictabilities and indeterminate in terms of outcomes, that thesis is actually negated by the ubiquity of evolutionary convergence. This idea of Darwin's compass is supported by evolutionary convergence. And the main point being here is that because we see organisms arriving repeatedly at the same biological solution, this provides not only a degree of predictability, but intriguingly points to a deeper structure to life. And you can imagine a landscape that evolution must necessarily navigate. And life goes to these isolated islands, which are these havens of biological possibility in this ocean of maladaptiveness. And of course, Ernst Mayr and other philosophers of biology, they can protest when some a priori concepts of teleology that come from a non-empirical metaphysical system, whether it's theist or atheist, and those ideas are imposed or imported into biology. But, however, in this case, it is widely agreed that the notion of teleology actually emerges from the study of the evolutionary process itself. And this is an empirical observation and conclusion that's made after the fact. It's abducted or inferred from the observation of the evolutionary process, not deduced from a non-physical, metaphysical system of ideas. And so what's important here is this. Biological evolutionary history seems to show us that we can't just so simply reject the apparent purpose and direction that we see emerging time and time again from the natural world. Is there a deeper structure to biology that is yet to be understood or explained? And could it be that there is some yet to be understood deeper structure to biology that explains the apparent islands of stability that somehow evolutionary search mechanisms are able to arrive at these solutions over the course of the development of life? Let's do a quick recap now with the two main ideas in this section in simpler terms. Is there a deeper structure to biology? We started this section by talking about how it's useful and beneficial to talk about biology in terms of purpose and design. We have eyes in order to see, an eagle has wings in order to fly. Wherever we look, we see what seems to be purpose and design in living things. Teleology in biology. At least it rhymes, right? This led us to also consider if evolution itself is inherently directional, in other words, teleological, or is it purely random, in other words, contingent. The numerous examples of convergent evolution seem to reveal that yes, life repeats itself and has an ability to find the correct solution repeatedly, and chance processes may not be enough to tell the whole story. It's as if there is something about the evolutionary process that's able to navigate life through this vast ocean to find these islands of stability where life can flourish using Darwin's compass. And this all seems to point us to a deeper structure to life, one that is yet to be understood or explained. And so that's where we'll leave off for today. See you next time for part 2. Hi everyone, welcome to session 9, part 2 of evolution, our last scientific apologetic session. It's been such a pleasure for Angel and I to get to teach this course, and in fact, we both worked on this particular lesson together, so just want to give a shout out to Angel, and hopefully you've been able to learn a lot through these past weeks. So first, let's review what we talked about last time. What is evolution? We defined the term evolution and talked about the 3 different aspects of the contemporary evolutionary paradigm. In our conversations about evolution, it's important to understand what definition we're working with. Evolution says that life developed gradually through successive generations of organisms. And over long periods of time, we see species changing and adapting to their environments by the process that we call Darwinism, natural selection operating on random variation. Next, we talked about how atheism has a particular take on Darwinian evolution, one which goes beyond even Darwin's original intent. Atheism uses Darwinian evolution, which seems random and directionless, to say that there is therefore no design, no purpose in biology whatsoever, and it only seems that life is designed. And as a result, no designer, no God. Furthermore, Darwinian evolution is extrapolated to become this meta-narrative that explains all of reality. However, we clarified that Darwinian evolution, properly understood, is a scientific theory about how life developed, and in fact is neither anti-theistic or theistic. Evolution does not exclude the possibility of God's providential design working in and through evolutionary processes that may seem random. Evolution, properly understood, can be compatible with Christianity. We also talked about how we see purpose and design in living things, and the usefulness of talking about biology in terms of purpose and design, teleology. This also led us to consider if evolution itself is inherently directional or if it is purely random, in other words, contingent. Stephen Jay Gould talked about the contingency thesis, where the evolutionary process is governed by chance events in history. If you replay the tape, each time you would get radically different outcomes. But what do we actually observe? We observe that life seems to converge upon predictable evolutionary outcomes to fit particular needs, so-called islands of stability. The numerous examples of convergent evolution seem to reveal that, yes, life repeats itself and has an ability to find the correct solution repeatedly, and chance processes may not be enough to tell the whole story. It's as if the evolutionary process itself uses something like a compass, a so-called Darwinian compass, and is able to navigate life through this vast ocean to find these islands of stability where life can actually flourish. And as we suggested, that all of this seems to point to a deeper structure to life, one that is yet to be understood or explained. And so, like I said last time, our goal for you is to be aware of and familiar with some of the topics of conversation and differing views amongst Christians on evolution, and also that you be able to provide a reasonable defense of Christianity on this topic. So let's start by looking at evolutionary creation. To review, one of the points we talked about last week was how we tried to clear up some misunderstandings regarding Darwin and how his theories were not to be taken to support only atheism. He had a deep concern, actually, about the effect of his theory on religious belief, and in fact, in The Origin of Species, he writes about the possibility of a harmonious interpretation of his theories. He says, "I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. A celebrated author and divine has written to me that he has gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms, and to believe that he required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws." And he even concludes in Origin of Species, "There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that was this planet was gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning. Endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And so that description by Darwin in the Origin of Species presents a picture of how one can imagine evolution working together with the biblical or religious framework, providing even a certain reflection on the quality of such a creator, one who is noble, empowering life with this kind of power to be able to self-develop into needful forms out of original forms, evolving into the most beautiful and most wonderful forms, as he said. So evolutionary creation. We'll also refer to it here as EC. It's the Christian viewpoint on the origin of life and evolution. The overarching idea of EC is that God used a completely natural process, evolution, to create all of life. Within EC, there are varying views about the degree of God's action in the natural world, but most people who ascribe to EC would agree with these two basic claims. God acted to bring about the universe, in the form of the Big Bang, for example. God acted to bring about the origin of life. Now, other EC versions may say that it's an unknown process, but the above claims would be consistent with the scientific data that support evolution, and they do not necessarily contradict with belief in Christianity. So what is evolutionary creation? Again, it's a Christian viewpoint, sometimes referred to as theistic evolution. It's not intended to be a scientific theory, though it mostly accepts the mainline peer-reviewed scientific body of data, including evolution. It espouses the same beliefs as the gospel, as mainline Christianity. That God governed the process of creating humankind and gave us our abilities, gave us spiritual capacities, calling us to an elevated position within creation. He made man for a personal relationship with God. Man sinned, man rebelled against God, all have sinned. None are righteous apart from Christ, and his death on the cross forgives our sins. Christ is our salvation. And also regarding the creation account, they believe that based on the scientific evidence, God used evolution, a natural process, to create life. And so they still are what you would call creationists, the belief that God made the universe and all of life. By the way, you may have also heard of biologos, a term that Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project and current head of the National Institute of Health, created and uses. It comes from the Greek word bios, which means life, and logos, which means word. Life coming from God's word, and this idea of God being the word coming from John 1:1. Started an organization by that name, Biologos, to present EC and also discuss the topic of science and religion. So what are their claims? There are many variations, like I said, on the theme of EC, but typical versions rest on these premises. The universe came into being out of nothingness approximately 14 billion years ago, so the Big Bang, and then the anthropic principle. Despite massive improbabilities, the propensities of the universe appear to have been precisely tuned for life. And on the origin of life, while the precise mechanism of the origin of life on Earth remains unknown, once life arose, the process of evolution and natural selection permitted the development of biological diversity and complexity over very long periods of time. And on the evolutionary paradigm, once evolution got underway, no special supernatural intervention was required, and humans are part of this process, sharing a common ancestor with the great apes. And finally, humans are also unique in ways that defy evolutionary explanation and point to our spiritual nature. And so this includes the existence of the moral law, the knowledge of right and wrong, and the search for God that characterizes all human cultures throughout history. And so evolutionary creationist says, with these 6 premises, a plausible, intellectually satisfying, logically consistent synthesis emerges. God, outside of space and time, made the universe. He set aside the laws that govern it. He set the natural laws that govern it, and God chose the mechanism of evolution to create life of all sorts to populate the earth, including humans who would have intelligence and knowledge of the moral law, right and wrong, free will and desire for relationship with God. However, humans would ultimately choose to disobey this moral law. This is compatible with what science teaches us about the natural world and also the monotheistic religions. So evolutionary creation believes that there is ample evidence for evolution as the mechanism for the development of all life. And so next, here are some more scientific evidences that they cite. Now, with the completion of the Human Genome Project, more genomic data became available. The comparative analysis of large amounts of genomic data from different organisms seems to cumulatively point to support common ancestry. And so what is a genome? Well, a genome is simply all an organism's genetic material, its entire DNA sequence. For example, the human genome is a sequence of 3 billion base pairs. It would be like a book composed of 3 billion letters, or amounting to about 500 Bibles. Starting with the Human Genome Project, we'll talk about some of the surprising findings. The Human Genome Project was a huge international effort led by Francis Collins to sequence the entire human genome, and it was completed in 2003, exactly about 50 years after the discovery of DNA as the information storage molecule of the cell. Now, how did their results address the topic of common ancestry, the idea that organisms came from a single ancestor? Did Homo sapiens descend from a common ancestor, as with mice and chimpanzees and so on? Francis Collins said, "The study of genomes leads inexorably to the conclusion that we humans share a common ancestor with other living things, and this was a result of detailed DNA sequence comparisons of human DNA with other organisms. Comparing coding regions of human genes, that is, the parts that contain the information for proteins, with their counterparts in other organisms, there is a high likelihood of finding a similar sequence in another species. As you go further down and compare coding sequences with the lower animals, the matches become less perfect. In contrast, when you do a similar comparison of the non-coding regions, the sequences are much less similar. And so why is there this difference? One idea is that according to natural selection, functional genes will be preserved with each subsequent generation, and therefore mutations will be observed less frequently, whereas mutations can more readily accumulate over time in the non-coding regions, sometimes referred to as junk DNA. Those who challenge this conclusion may say that such similarities could simply demonstrate that God may have used successful design principles over and over again. But according to Francis Collins, a detailed look at genomes makes that interpretation virtually untenable. So, for example, now that both human and mouse genomes have been sequenced with high accuracy, close comparisons can be made, and based on the data, it seems unlikely that the similarities are the direct result of a reusing of a successful successful design principles. So, for example, comparing the human and mouse genomes, in terms of the big picture comparisons, the overall size of both genomes is roughly the same. The inventory of protein coding genes is also roughly similar. And now, when we make some detailed sequence comparisons, one interesting observation is that the order of the genes along the human and mouse chromosomes is generally maintained over substantial stretches of DNA. For example, if you have human genes A, B, and C, you'll see their mouse counterparts, A, B, and C genes, in that same order, though the spacing in between may be different. Sometimes this correlation, it extends over long distances. For example, virtually all the genes on human chromosome 17 are also found on mouse chromosome 11. Now, why is this the case? If the order is important for their function, one can imagine that, a designer could have kept the same order in multiple acts of creation. However, there is no evidence from the current understanding of molecular biology that the order of these genes over these long chromosomal distances are critical for their proper function. The more likely explanation is that the order of the genes was preserved because it was simply handed down that way from one organism to the next and to the next and so on. Secondly, what about the DNA sequences in between the genes? These DNA sequences are called non-coding regions. While some regulatory and other functional elements reside in these non-coding regions, it's believed that most of it has no known function, and in fact, it is sometimes referred to as junk DNA. In these non-coding regions, we find something called AREs, or ancient repetitive elements, and these arise from jumping genes. They are able to copy and insert themselves in various locations in the genome, and usually without any functional consequence. Mammalian genomes are littered with such AREs, and about 45% of the human genome is made up of such discarded sequences. When you line up sections of the human and mouse genome anchored by genes that appear in the same order, AREs are actually approximately in the same order as well in these two genomes. Why would these non-functional sequences appear at the same relative locations? It has a striking appearance that some time ago in a common mammalian ancestor, those AREs arrived in the genome at those very locations and have just been carried along ever since. And the data would be quite consistent with that hypothesis. These data points challenge the idea that all species were created ex nihilo, out of nothing. Because if so, one would have to ask, did God place these useless sequences there at the same precise locations to confuse and to mislead us? And the likelihood is maybe not. Next, when we compare now our genomes with our closest living relative, the chimpanzee, the data seems to also show that we fit into this evolutionary tree of life. In this example, we'll look at human and chimpanzee genomes. The chimpanzee is the closest living relative to humans. The genome is 96% identical at the DNA sequence level when you compare the DNA sequences. Another example of the close relationship is when we look at the anatomy of human and chimp chromosomes, as seen in this picture. We see that each chromosome contains hundreds of genes. The image depicts all the chromosomes lined up. Humans have 23 pairs, chimpanzees have 24 pairs. And taking a closer look, the differences in the number of chromosomes seems to be the result of a chromosomal fusion event where two ancestral chromosomes somehow got fused together to generate human chromosome number 2. Note that for the gorilla and orangutan, each also have 24 chromosome pairs like the chimp. And so 3 pieces of data are used to support this fusion event idea. The 2 chimpanzee chromosomes have identical DNA sequences that are also found in human chromosome number 2. And in addition, at the very end of every chromosome are telomeres. And these are very specific DNA repeats, telomeric repeats they're called. And they don't generally appear elsewhere, but are found where this fusion event would have happened in the middle of the fused chromosome number 2. Now, each chromosome also has only one centromere, but human chromosome 2 seems to also have the remnants of this other centromere. It's like as if there's a DNA imprint that has been left behind as humans evolved from a common ancestor with the apes. Now, if God had used, again, similar design principles, there's no compelling reason why there would be this appearance of this fusion event, as there's no compelling reason to expect that there's a particular function for this chromosome fusion. Now, looking at this evidence, it's difficult to explain or understand these observations without imagining that there was, at some point, some common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. These data points seem very interesting, and there are others that are not included here, and for more, you can actually find them in The Language of God by Francis Collins. And as you might imagine, there are all kinds of counter-arguments to this evidence that argue the other side of the case. So we may want to hold these conclusions with a grain of salt. These responses, they challenge some of the data and accuracy of the analysis, but for the most part, I think the general argument presented and the point being made seems quite powerful. Collins says that virtually all working biologists are convinced that Darwin's framework of variation and natural selection is right. The study of genomes provide molecular support for the theory of evolution. And he says, no serious biologist today doubts the theory of evolution to explain the marvelous complexity and diversity of life. In fact, there are many serious biologists who are also serious believers. This list includes Asa Gray, a chief advocate of Darwin in the 19th century in the US, and also Theodosius Dobzhansky, a 20th century architect of evolutionary thinking and devout Eastern Orthodox Christian. And he also said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. A number of some other well-known proponents of evolutionary creation include B.B. Warfield, C.S. Lewis, Billy Graham, Tim Keller, N.T. Wright, Pope John Paul II. These, among others, held favorable views toward EC or some other variation or form of EC, as there are, like I said, many versions out there. So from the EC viewpoint, given this interpretation of the data, the working hypothesis that evolution was God's mechanism, the how, of how life came about, even humans. Now, up to this point, we've spent a lot of time on examples that illustrate the viability of the evolutionary paradigm and evidence supporting common ancestry. However, evolution is not without its problems. So now we'll talk about problems with the current evolutionary paradigm. On the topic of the problem with the current evolutionary paradigm, we'll also use the phrase neo-Darwinism here. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute and one of the architects of intelligent design recounts how, at a recent conference at the Royal Society of London in 2016, a prestigious gathering of top scientists were there, and Austrian evolutionary biologist Gerd Müller began the conference by outlining the explanatory deficits of the modern synthesis, that is, of neo-Darwinism, the current evolutionary paradigm. So we'll take a look at three, which basically are the problem of how does neo-Darwinism explain the origin of new body plans and body types. Here it's called the origin of phenotypic complexity. And number two, how does it explain anatomical novelty? Because while the mutation selection mechanism seems to explain small-scale variations, it doesn't really seem to explain large-scale ones. We can see the beaks of birds adapting to different weather patterns, but where do we get things like birds in the first place? Third, what about the third point is, what about the abrupt appearance of new forms of life in the fossil record, the problem of the origin of non-gradual modes of transition? And so we'll start with this particular challenge that's seen in the fossil record. While the evidence for a common ancestry seems to be powerful, it has some challenges. Evolution predicts the gradual transition from one type of organism to another, leading to another, resulting in something like this great branching tree. However, when talking about major new groups of animals, when looking at the data, what we see is an abrupt appearance that doesn't seem to give any evidence of that kind of gradual continuous change that's seen in that tree of life. A key example used for this is the Cambrian explosion. This is when the first major animal forms appeared abruptly in the fossil record more than 500 million years ago. And according to the predictions of evolutionary theory, history and common descent, what should we have expected to see? Well, a series of intermediates of ancestral forms gradually leading up to these new forms of life. And so as you can see, the intermediate forms are represented by all those blue dots. However, instead, what we actually see in the fossil record is new forms appearing abruptly without any discernible connection to similar animals in the lower sedimentary strata. And so the origin of animals appears abruptly, represented by these gold dots here. And so what then? Well, there seems to be this tension between the theory and the data. The picture doesn't really seem to match with what we find in the fossil record. And this is what one could call the mystery of the missing fossils. In fact, some scientists have come to doubt the common ancestry aspect of the evolutionary paradigm as a result of these findings. Darwin himself also expressed doubt regarding the adequacy of his theory to explain the evidence of Cambrian animals arising in the fossil record, but missing those fossils in the periods prior to the Cambrian. Some time ago in the mid-90s, a huge fossil find was made in southern China, which made the problem of the Cambrian explosion worse because many new forms of animal life were found that had not been known before. Each was lacking ancestral intermediates or forms in the lower strata, and the Chinese paleontologists expressed a lot of skepticism about Darwinian evolution. Near the end of a lecture by Professor J.Y. Chen presenting his findings, he talked about the challenge that his fossil find posed to neo-Darwinism. The fossils of Mao Tianshan turned Darwin's tree of life upside down. Though neo-Darwinism could have expected simpler forms of life giving rise through a continuous process of change to more complex life forms, instead what we find very complex forms of life that exist right from the beginning with no discernible connection below. He took his hand raised and turned it upside down. The data, he said, turns the tree of life upside down. Instead of a common ancestor giving rise to many, the data seemed to show that there was the sudden appearance of many. Again, contrary to what neo-Darwinian theory would have predicted. So that's a big challenge that the thesis of common ancestry faces and needs to explain. Now let's move on to perhaps the most important issue that Gerd Müller and others raised, the inadequacy of the current evolutionary mechanism of mutation selection to explain novelty and complexity, how new animal body forms and plans arose, as well as large-scale variations and changes. Müller and co-author Stuart Newman have elsewhere argued that neo-Darwinism has no theory of the generative. Others have explained that mutation and selection can account for the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. That is minor but not major changes. And so what's going on here is that neo-Darwinism, it involves making a huge leap. It extrapolates from limited cases and jumps to the grand evolutionary scenario. But is the mechanism of evolution actually a viable and sufficient mechanism? For neo-Darwinism to work, the mechanisms of natural selection operating on random mutation must be sufficient to bring about the complexity and novelty that's seen in life. What's the scientific evidence used to show that the mechanism is sufficient to bring about this level of change? First, it's repeatedly observed that adaptations and microevolution, it does occur, as in the classic examples of peppered moths and dark moths, which were simply a reflection of changes in the allele frequencies already present in the population for pigment coloration, or the adaptive radiation that's seen in the Darwinian Galapagos finches, or the examples of bacteria developing antibiotic drug resistance. Scientists, they've been running long-term evolutionary experiments to see what changes can be observed in bacteria by Darwinian mechanisms, but have been met with limited success. And these experiments have shown that the beneficial mutations are overwhelmingly degradative. They are mutations that break down the function of the gene. And this is quite far from bacteria evolving some novel or complex feature. Lynn Margulis, leading evolutionary biologist from the University of Massachusetts, said, "Mutations, in summary, tend to induce sickness, death, or deficiencies. No evidence in the vast literature of hereditary changes shows unambiguous evidence that random mutation itself, even with geographic isolation, leads to speciation, leads to fundamentally new things. What we don't see is large-scale changes in body forms. Again, we might see the adaptive radiation of Darwin's finches in terms of their size and their beaks, but not the gradual appearance of novel forms like birds themselves. The challenge facing Darwinian evolution is providing adequate explanatory mechanisms for the creative power of natural selection and random mutation or other alleged mechanisms of macroevolutionary innovation." And so once again, to review, the big problem in Darwinian evolution is explaining the origin of novelty and complexity, where the new forms of life come from, explaining how did it happen. And so quickly, here are a couple examples that introduce just some of the limitations of Darwinian mechanisms to drive these kind of larger evolutionary changes. When we consider developmental biology, it casts doubt on the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism. Developmental biologists have discovered that only mutations that affect the early stages of embryological development can alter an entire body plan, that is, major evolutionary change. However, mutations that affect animals early on in development are inevitably lethal. The early-acting beneficial body plan altering mutations never occur. Late-acting mutations, they don't generate new body plans. I mean, imagine something like the gene encoding for the pigmentation on those peppered moths. Those won't change the overall form of the moth. So the question remains open. How can the evolutionary processes overcome the difficulty of producing these major changes in animal form? This remains an open question, and mainstream evolutionary biologists have not been able to sufficiently answer this question. Without going into too much detail, development is a highly regulated process where the right genes have to be expressed at the right time and place. And in fact, it's like an integrated network of genes and proteins. And any sort of change leads to disruption and either loss of a body part or viability of the organism altogether. And so how could a new, better animal body plan arise simply from mutations? You don't need just new genes, but entirely new integrated networks. The conclusion from these kinds of limitations of Darwinian evolution is that many evolutionary biologists have been led to doubt the creative power of mutations, of the mutation selection mechanism, and they reject textbook neo-Darwinism, the contemporary evolutionary paradigm. And as such, many biologists have been pursuing new theories of evolution based on various proposed mechanisms as part of this sort of extended evolutionary synthesis, but none have yet sufficiently been able to explain the origin of the genetic and even epigenetic information that's needed to generate biological novelty. And thus far, no proposed mechanism provides the creative power seen in evolutionary history, and this presents a serious unknown in the modern synthesis of the contemporary evolutionary paradigm, explaining how it all happened. And that leads us to our next topic, intelligent design. Intelligent design. So it doesn't negate evolution as a mechanism, but it points to failings of the evolutionary theory to account for all of life's complexities. It opens up the possibility that God did not just wind up the universe and then let naturalistic processes take over, but that he might have also intervened at other points in the timeline of the universe to promote life as we know it today. Intelligent design is intended to be a scientific theory that doesn't just hypothesize some sort of divine intervention, but to show through scientific observations that intelligence is a plausible explanation for life. It's not entirely divergent from EC either. Here are some of the similarities that it shares. There's the Big Bang. 14 billion years ago, the universe erupted from a singularity to which it is still expanding today. But where did it all come from? Like we talked about in our second lecture, it must have been some sort of uncaused cause, unbound by space and time or matter. with anthropic principle or fine-tuning, that despite the numerous possibilities for each of the many constants of the universe, all of them happen to be at the precise values to give a life-permitting universe. The probability of that happening by chance are close to zero, and it's almost as if the universe were designed by some sort of intelligence. And so both EC and ID point to some sort of intelligent creator who set the universe in motion. For EC, that's the only point where God intervened, and for the rest of those 14 billion years, everything formed through entirely naturalistic processes, and life came as a result of evolutionary mechanisms at work. Now, the point of difference with ID is in what happens next. Of course, just note here that some EC versions do include the origin of life as another point where God may have intervened. Now, here are some lines of scientific evidence that support this idea of intelligent design. With the origin of life, EC says that it's an outcome of some type of unknown, undirected process, chance, necessity, or both. But proponents of ID look at the origin of life and start to question whether that is the case. Could all the specified complexity that we see in DNA and proteins really have arisen from just those mechanisms alone? If you remember in lectures 5 and 6, we looked at those different possibilities, and we found that chance alone to even form one small functional protein was less probable than the entire probabilistic resources of the universe. When we looked at self-organization or necessity, whether the natural, chemical, and physical laws could lead to life's complexities, when we looked at that and looked at DNA, we found that there was no chemical reason why one base should be in a certain position relative to another. And yet, the sequence of bases was very specific in forming the right kinds of proteins. So then we tried to look at both mechanisms working together, utilizing an interplay of chance and natural selection. But in order for natural selection to work, you need to be able to reproduce, which itself is a complex interplay of DNA and proteins and the very things that you are trying to form in the first place. So given these improbabilities, another valid explanation is intelligence, which itself is the only known mechanism to create information, of which we see encoded in DNA and proteins. The other main aspect of intelligent design is irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity makes the claim that the undirected processes of mutations and natural selection cannot account for the intricate complexity in nature, that there are these certain systems, especially with regards to the biochemistry of the cell and the molecular machines that are found in there, that they are irreducibly complex, built upon one another, such that if you were to remove one piece of such an irreducibly complex system, the whole system would fall apart. Examples that were presented include the flagella, the bacteria flagella, and also the immune system. And irreducible complexity makes this argument that in order for these systems to be put into place, to be selected in the first place, it had to be via some sort of directed process. According to intelligent design, based on these observations in nature and putting all these clues together, what would be the inference to the best explanation? And for these scientific observations related to the origin of life, the origin of functional proteins, genetic information, the proposal of irreducibly complex systems, and so on, the best explanation for these phenomena would be design. Random chance and necessity are insufficient to explain all of life. Now, there are some objections. One is intelligent design science? It makes that claim in the beginning that it is a scientific theory. Now, this is kind of controversial. While ID poses good questions as to whether evolution can fully explain the specified complexity that we see and observe in nature, it has a hard time being experimentally verifiable. The proposal of supernatural forces is scientifically speaking, it leads to a dead end. In addition, it has difficulty providing a mechanism by which supernatural interventions would give rise to complexity. For example, if the flagella is an irreducibly complex system, how did it get produced? Like, what is the exact mechanism? While the type 3 secretory system falls short of explanation, there is no corresponding alternate hypothesis from irreducible complexity. And that being said, ID does base its conclusions on empirical evidence. It's not actually coming out from religious dogma. So, for example, with the complexity of DNA, it's based off of observations of the discovery of digital information in the cell, and it's trying to make that argument. While the conclusions might be debated, they are derived using standard scientific reasoning that infer a valid explanation. Another critique is whether intelligent design is a God of the gaps argument. Like we talked about briefly at the end of the irreducible complexity talk, ID has been accused of being a God in the gaps argument, or an argument from ignorance, meaning that because there is no good explanation at the moment for something like specified complexity via natural causes, then people just invoked the mysterious notion of intelligence, sort of like a fig leaf for ignorance, accusing ID of pushing an agenda and really being creationism cloaked in science. But is that really what ID is? Going back to specified complexity in DNA and proteins, true, part of the argument was built on the inadequacy of proposed materialistic causes. But then intelligence was not just chosen because we wanted a divine explanation. It's based on the information-rich properties of DNA and proteins, in addition to observations and repeated experiences that show intelligent agents can and do produce information-rich systems. In fact, large amounts of specified complexity invariably have some sort of creative intelligence behind them, like flower arrangements or the Rosetta Stone. So rather than being an argument from ignorance, it actually constitutes an inference to the best explanation. At the same time, there have been some examples of irreducible complexity where further discoveries of new biological mechanisms such as gene duplications or transposons have shown that perhaps some irreducibly complex systems are not so complex after all and could have potentially been formed through an undirected evolutionary process. So there is still so much more to be figured out and elucidated. And so, as we conclude our last part in evolution, where does it lead us? We're presented with these options, and yeah, it can seem confusing. I mean, people are saying different things, seemingly making strong critiques of one another's ideas, and they are quite impassioned views. Now, we should also keep in mind that, as in any viewpoint, there are legitimate counterpoints and challenges that need to be addressed, and we were not able to discuss any of those in depth here, as our main goal, given the time that we have, is to present these viewpoints. But you might be wondering, like, okay, so what is the right answer? Well, quite honestly, we're not so sure either. Given how much we still don't know, we're not concluded on this. And personally, I'd say that we'd probably land somewhere along the spectrum of EC and ID. And there are pros and cons to both sides, and we probably will never really know until we get to ask God. But before we go deep down into those kinds of debates, we have to remind ourselves, kind of take a step back, and again think about, where does the conflict really lie? And again, like we covered in our philosophy of science portion, the conflict is not between faith and science, but rather the conflict is between faith and scientism, or faith and naturalism. And so that's something that we really need to remember. And that this more important question then is, was life and the universe created by God or not? Was God the original cause of all that we see? And from what we presented through this course, I think that the more probable answer is yes. God created the universe, God created everything in it, and whether he did it all at the beginning and then allowing the laws of physics and Darwinian mechanisms of evolution to take over under his divine providence, or whether he intervened at certain points along the history of the universe to allow for the complexity of life to arise as we know it today, God created the universe and everything in it. I think there is plenty of evidence that is in favor of that argument that God does exist. There is good evidence that we do not live in an atheistic universe, and like we said in the first lesson in Psalm 19:1, the heavens do declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork, and maybe not only the universe, but also in the details of the complexity of life itself. Once more, here's Darwin's reflections on the wonder of life. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. And so regardless of how God precisely did it, the one thing that it does point to, I think, one thing that we know is that as we consider nature, as we consider life, as we consider the universe, we can be amazed at the immense power and wisdom of God. And so we can have confidence when speaking to skeptics, and we can have confidence in the midst of our own doubts. And so let's exercise faith and invite people into faith, because at the end of the day, it does indeed take faith to believe that God created the universe, as it says in Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. What we talked about during this course is really only the tip of the iceberg. There is a lot more out there. And so we encourage you to continue reading, to continue learning. And our vision is that God will continue to equip all of you so that together we can unveil the eyes of unbelievers to be able to see the light of the gospel.